Chapter 19, Section 2 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 19, The Principate of Galba and the Year of the Four Emperors, Section 2. Otho and Vitellius. But a rival to Otho was already in the field. While these things were enacted at Rome, events of great moment were taking place in Germany. After the murder of Fonteia's capital, the legatus of Lower Germany, Galba had selected Aulus Vitellius to take his place. This Vitellius was the son of Lucius Vitellius, who had commanded in the east under Tiberius and been censor with Claudius. Aulus had gained the favor of Nero, had been proconsul and legatus in Africa, but was little fitted for the post for which Galba had chosen him. He was insignificant and good-natured, sensual and indolent. He had no ambition, but circumstances led him to the supreme power. The legions of both Lower and Upper Germany were discontented with the rule of Galba. They were jealous because he had been created by the Spanish legion, and they did not see why they too should not make an imperator. The recall of Virginius had especially exasperated the troops of the Upper Province, and on the calends of January, the 4th and the 22nd legions at Mogontiacum had refused to take the oath of allegiance to Galba, and had placed themselves, as Galba himself had done when he threw off the yoke of Nero, at the disposal of the Senate and the Roman people. The governor Hordionius did not venture to interfere. But it was in the Lower Province that a candidate for the empire was found. On the same night the news from Mogontiacum reached Vitellius as he was supping at Colonia. He immediately sent messengers to the legions of his own province in their various quarters. 1st Germanica was stationed at Bona, 5th Alauda and 15th Primigenia at Vetera, and 16th Gallica at Novesium. On the next day Fabius Valens, legatus of Legion I, arrived from Bona with some horse soldiers, and saluted Vitellius as imperator. On the following day, January the 3rd, the Upper Army, which had not found a candidate of its own, abandoned the empty and high-sounding names of the Senate and the Roman people, and acknowledged Vitellius. The ardor of the troops was emulated by the provincials of Colonia, the Treveri, and the Lingones, whose city is now represented by Langres. Valerius Asiaticus, the legatus of Belgica, and Blsesus, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, along with Legion I Italica, which properly belonged to Upper Germany, but was then stationed at Lugdunum, declared themselves for the new imperator. Vitellius himself was perhaps the least enthusiastic of all. He took little active part in the preparations for overthrowing Galba, and entrusted the conduct of his cause to his officers, especially to Aulus Caecina Alienus in the Upper Province, and Gaius Fabius Valens in the Lower. Caecina was a young, strong, able, ambitious, and popular legatus. It was decided to advance upon Italy and Rome, and the armament was divided into 3 parts. Caecina, at the head of 36,000 men, was to cross the Pennine Alps. Valens, with 40,000, was to march through Gaul and penetrate by the Caudian Pass, and both were to join their forces at Cremona. Vitellius, with the main body of the army, was to come slowly after. His presence was not required, for the troops were so excited that they needed no stimulus. The cause of Vitellius found great sympathy in those parts of Gaul which had declared against Vindex and had been punished by Galba. The progress of Valens was marked by rapacity and military license. All the cities through which he passed were required to furnish a contribution to the expedition, and special severity was shown to places like Augustodunum and Vienna, which had found favor with Galba. Caecina's march lay through the highlands of the Helvetii, who resented the license of the soldiers. The natives were fierce, and the course of the army was marked by slaughter. The Helvetii were at length driven into their town Aventicum, and yielded only to the menace of a siege. But before the army of Vitellius reached Italy, the murder of Galba and accession of Otho had altered the position of affairs. Otho prepared to meet the armies of his rival, but he first made overtures to Vitellius, offering him a quiet and luxurious retreat if he retired from the field. If the decision had lain with Vitellius himself, this offer would probably have been accepted, but it really lay with the army, and the army had no intention of retreating. The question could only be decided by arms. Most of the western provinces declared for Vitellius, the three Gauls, Narbonensis, Rhaetia, and Britain. Otho was recognized in Spain and Illyricum, but Spain soon deserted him, and then the west was entirely on the side of his rival. Thus Otho had the praetorians and the 4 legions of Pannonia, Dalmatia, and Mysia to oppose to the forces of Vitellius. Besides this, he obtained the recognition of the eastern provinces of Egypt and Africa, though he could look for no active support from those quarters. It is highly probable that he would have come off victorious in the conflict which followed if he had acted with promptitude and entrusted the supreme military command to one competent general. He was no soldier himself, but he had at his disposal several able officers, such as Suetonius Paulinus, Marius Celsus, Vestricius Spurinna. Instead of trusting them, he listened to the counsels of Licinius Proculus, the praetorian prefect, who was inexperienced in warfare. And instead of hastening to occupy the passes of the Alps before the enemy reached the frontiers of Italy, he delayed in Rome. The position of Otho was a difficult one for a man who, like him, had little talent for ruling men. He was embarrassed by the veiled hostility of the senators, who regretted Galba, a man after their own heart, and while they were obliged to accept Otho, would have been pleased at his fall. Otho endeavored to conciliate them and strictly observe their privileges, but in vain. And the difficulty was aggravated by the hostility of the praetorians to the senators. On one occasion, a party of nobles, whom Otho was entertaining, were almost murdered by the soldiers, who suspected them of a conspiracy against the emperor. The remarkable circumstance that no copper coinage was issued by the Senate under Otho may be partly explained by the fact that he was not made Pontifex Maximus until March the 9th. The Senate may have delayed until he received the full number of the imperial titles. The enthusiasm of the populace, who greeted Otho as Nero and looked for a revival of Nero's liberal policy, did not tend to conciliate the senators. Otho even adopted the name Nero officially, but gave it up again in deference to the feelings of the Senate. He sacrificed Tigellinus, whom Galba had spared, to the public hatred. The praetorian soldiers were also a difficulty. They were conscious that Otho owed his position to them, and depended on their support as his best arm in the coming struggle. It was therefore impossible to oppose them or maintain strict discipline. He had placed himself in a false position at the beginning by allowing them to choose their own prefects. In the 2 months which elapsed between the accession of Otho and his departure from the city, there are few acts of general policy to record. Occupied with preparations for the war, he had little time for government. In Spain, the colonies of Hispalis and Emerita were strengthened. The province of Baetica was increased in extent by the addition of some districts in the land beyond the strait. Africa and Cappadocia received various privileges. An invasion of Mysia by the Roxolani, a Sarmatian tribe, was repelled, and the victorious officers were rewarded by Otho with high distinctions. In these measures we can see the aim of Otho to strengthen his political position. The civil war began in March. The Republic had not been rent by domestic struggles. Italy had not been exposed to the disasters of warfare since the terrible years which followed the great Caesar's death. Men remembered Philippi, Mutina, and Perugia, and looked with horror to a repetition of such scenes. And the prospect was all the worse, as neither of the chiefs, for whom so much blood was to be shed, was worth fighting for. As candidates for the government of the republic, both the dissolute Otho and the gluttonous Vitellius were contemptible. They were instruments, it seemed, chosen by fate for the ruin of the state. But while Vitellius was torpid, Otho at least was active. When the time for action came, he threw off luxury, marched on foot, rough and unkempt, at the head of his troops, quite unlike himself. He set out from the city on the 14th of March, leaving his brother Titianus in charge at Rome, and forcing a number of senators, whom he feared to leave behind, to accompany him. The object of the Vitellians was to gain possession of Rome. Until their chief was recognized there by the people and the Senate, it was felt that he was only a pretender. The object of Otho was to prevent his enemy from crossing the Padus, the second defense of Italy, for the Alps, its first defense, had already been passed by Caecina. For this purpose Annius Gallus and Vespasius Spurinna had been sent on in advance, with a force consisting of 5 praetorian cohorts, and the remainder of the Legio Classica, numbered first, which had escaped the sword of Galba, besides a corps of 2,000 gladiators. They expected to be reinforced by 8,000 men sent forward from the 4 legions of Pannonia and Dalmatia, which were themselves following at leisure. Otho followed with the rest of the praetorians and a large number of marines. By his fleet he commanded the west coast of Italy, and was assured of the adhesion of Corsica and Sardinia. A division of troops was sent to seize the district of the maritime Alps and attack the province of Narbonensis. The procurator of the maritime district attempted resistance, and the irritated soldiers vented their wrath on the town of Albentimillum, Ventimiglia. The cities of Narbonensis, especially Forum Julii, sent for aid to Valens, who was advancing to join Caecina. In the battles which ensued, the Vitellian party was worsted, but the Euthonians retreated to Albingonum, Albenga, an inland city of Liguria. The beginnings of the war in this quarter were prosperous for Otho. When Caecina entered Cisalpine Gaul, he had won the adhesion of a squadron of cavalry which was stationed in that region and known as the Ala Siliana. Along with it the municipal towns of Mediolanum, Eporedia, Novaria, and Vercelli embraced the cause of Vitellius, and the invaders held most of the land between the Padus and the Alps. The communication between Rome and Illyricum, however, was uninterrupted. One of those corps of the Pannonian army which had been sent on in advance was captured by the Vitellians at Cremona, and some other divisions of the Ottonians were discomfited near Ticinum. But the first serious engagement took place at Placentia, which was defended by Vespasius Spurinna. Caecina himself had crossed the river to capture it, but the assault, in the course of which a large amphitheatre outside the town was consumed by fire, was unsuccessful. Caecina was forced to retire to his camp near Cremona. Meanwhile Annius Gallus was hastening to relieve Placentia, but on hearing that the enemy had been repelled, he took up a position at Betriacum, a place lying between Cremona and Mantua, and distant about 2 days' march from Verona. About the same time the Ottonian corps of gladiators, under Marcius Macer, crossed over to the north bank of the Padus, near Cremona, and defeated a body of Italian auxiliaries. It was thought that this success should have been followed up. The commanders, Gallus, Suetonius, and Celsus, were severely criticized by their own party, and their fidelity to Otho was questioned. In consequence of these suspicions, the emperor was led to summon his brother Titianus from Rome, and make him commander-in-chief. But before he arrived, the Ottonians achieved another success, which might have decided the war in their favor, but for the ill judgment or treachery of Suetonius Paulinus. This general and Marius Celsus had joined forces with Gallus at Betriacum. Caecina, disgusted with his failure at Placentia, and anxious to gain a victory before the arrival of his colleague Valens, determined to bring on an action, and with this intent placed an ambush of picked auxiliaries in woods overhanging the Pastumian way, at a place called Locus Castorum, from a temple of Castor and Pollux, 12 miles from Cremona. Some cavalry were detached to advance along the road and lure the enemy to the spot, but the Ottonian generals got intelligence of this stratagem and skilfully arranged a counter-stratagem. Gallus had been hurt by a fall from his horse. Accordingly, Celsus and Paulinus divided the command, Paulinus taking the infantry and Celsus the cavalry. They drew up their army on this wise. 3 Praetorian cohorts were placed in columns on the road itself, and formed the center of the array. On the left were posted the advance body, 2,000 strong, of the 13th Legion from Pannonia, with 5 auxiliary cohorts and 500 cavalry. On the right stood the 1st Classica, with 2 auxiliary cohorts, and likewise 500 cavalry. A body of 1,000 picked horsemen was placed in reserve. When the Vitellians, according to their plan, pretended to retreat in order to draw their opponents into the ambuscade, Celsus kept his men from advancing too far, and when the ambushed troops, sure of success, rushed out, he gradually retreated and drew them on into the snare which had been prepared for them. When Celsus and his cavalry, hotly pursued by the enemy, reached the 3 Praetorian cohorts stationed on the Via Postumia, the legionary soldiers, who were right and left of the Via, advanced and closed up in front, so as to oppose a continuous line to the pursuers. At the same time, the auxiliary cohorts on both sides were pushed forward, so as to take the Vitellians in the flanks. Finally, the reserve body of cavalry was dispatched to ride round and come on them in the rear, so that they were completely enclosed in the well-contrived snare. But Suetonius, for whatever reason, did not act with sufficient promptitude. He wasted time in preliminaries, and did not give the signal to the infantry to attack until many of the Vitellians had time to seek refuge in the vineyards adjacent to the road, where it was impossible to use the pila freely. But when the infantry of Suetonius at length attacked, they carried all before them. Caecina brought up his cohorts one by one, and each by itself was too weak to withstand the assault of the Ottonians. Caecina and his whole army, it was said, might have been annihilated, if Suetonius had not sounded a retreat, and hindered his troops from attempting to carry the enemy's camp at Cremona. Some suspected him of treachery. Valens had already arrived at Ticinum, and soon after this defeat pushed on to join forces with Caecina at Cremona. Meanwhile Otho came himself to Betriacum and held a council of war. Suetonius, Gallus, and Marius Celsus were of opinion that a general engagement should not be risked until the arrival of the Illyric legions, which in discipline and valor were a match for the troops of the Rhine. But Otho could not endure to wait longer for the decision of his fate, and Titianus and Proculus, who perhaps thought more of his wishes than his interests, voted for immediate action. Otho then retired to Brixellum (Brescello), and the army, which was now commanded nominally by Titianus, but really by Proculus, advanced westward from Betriacum and encamped 4 miles near Cremona. The ultimate strategical object seems to have been to reach the confluence of the Padus and the Adua 2 hours west of Cremona, so as to sever the communication between that city and Ticinum. Yet it is hardly credible that even Titianus would have conceived anything so rash as a flank march past the enemy stationed at Cremona. The messages of Otho, who was growing more and more impatient, induced his brother, notwithstanding the remonstrances of the more experienced generals, to advance further in the direction of the enemy. Meanwhile the Vitellians had been occupied in building a bridge across the Padus near the mouth of the Adua. Marcius Macer, with his gladiators, had endeavored to prevent them, and a struggle had taken place for the possession of an island in midstream, in which the gladiators were worsted by Batavian troops. They blamed Macer for this discomfiture, and he was with difficulty rescued from their vengeance. Flavius Sabinus was appointed in his stead with a general command over the Ottonian forces south of the river. On the 15th of April, Caecina, who had been hurrying on the building of the bridge, returned to Cremona, to find that the Ottonian forces had arrived within 4 miles of the place, that a body of their cavalry had attacked the camp, and that Valens had given the signal to march forth to fight. The battle which ensued, generally called the Battle of Betriacum, though more correctly the Battle of Cremona, is far less interesting from a military point of view than that of Locus Castorum, although, as things turned out, it decided the war. A report was spread that the Vitellians had abandoned their cause, and the Ottonians grounded their arms and hailed them as friends. But they were soon undeceived. The fighting took place on the high road and in the groves and vineyards on either side. The contending parties were equally matched, and on Otho's side the Legio Classica displayed conspicuous bravery. But there was no general action. The battle consisted of a series of desultory conflicts. The result was undecided until Otho's generals fled, and at the same moment reinforcements arrived for the Vitellians in the shape of the Batavian cohorts which had recently routed the gladiators. Their flank attack was decisive. The defeated army fled along the highroad to their camp, and next morning capitulated. Otho awaited the result at Brixellum, guarded by some divisions of the Praetorians. The defeat at Cremona was not in itself necessarily decisive of the war. He had still every chance of retrieving his fortunes with the help of the approaching legions from Illyricum. But he was weary of the uncertainty, and when the news of defeat came, he made up his mind to die. He did not think of his obligations to the troops which fought for him. Perhaps he felt unable to trust his generals. In the evening he called for 2 daggers, of which he chose the sharper, and placed it beneath his pillow. Having slept for some hours, he drew forth the weapon at daybreak and fell upon it. His dying groan was heard, and when his slaves rushed in, they found their master dead, on April the 17th. If in the effeminacy of his life he was supposed to resemble Nero, the resolution which he displayed in his death contrasted with Nero's ignoble end. His body was immediately placed on a pyre, and some of the Praetorians slew themselves on the spot. The ashes were buried under a humble monument. The Praetorians at Brixellum then offered the empire to Virginius Rufus, who was in attendance on Otho, and he declined their offer, as he had before refused that of the legions of Germany. No course remained but submission to Vitellius. The victorious armies plundered and desolated the Italian cities, which had already been exhausted by the soldiers of Otho, and Valens and Caecina did not attempt to hinder the rapine. In Rome, the news of Otho's death was received with joy. The Senate met and decreed to Vitellius all the imperial titles by a single act, on April the 19th. Just as Otho had been regarded as the successor of Nero, Vitellius was considered the successor of Galba. The images of Galba were borne, crowned with flowers, to the spot in the forum where he had fallen. Everything was done to conciliate the Germanic legions, to whose approach Rome looked forward with dread. End of chapter 19, section 2.